You wouldn't last a week, not in your body, not in your mind, not with what you know and what you expect from life, because everything you take for granted today, warmth, food, sleep, safety, dignity, doesn't exist here. Imagine opening your eyes to a room that isn't a room, but a hut. One room, no windows, no bed, no light except what trickles in through gaps in the mud and straw walls. You've been asleep on wet straw, curled around someone else's legs, your wife, or maybe your child, you can't tell, because it's the only way to stay warm. You didn't sleep well, you never do. You woke up twice to scratch the fleas chewing through your legs. The smoke from last night's fire still lingers in the air, thick, sour, stinging. Your throat feels raw, your nose is full of ash. There's no chimney, just a hole in the roof that leaks when it rains and freezes when it doesn't. You can't stand up straight in the room. The rafters are too low. You're already hunched anyway. Your back hasn't fully straightened in years. When you sit up, you feel straw clinging to your skin and something crawling beneath your shirt, a louse probably. You don't bother removing it. You've stopped caring. Everyone itches. Everyone stinks. There's no such thing as clean. You spit on the floor and rub your eyes with the same hand you used yesterday to wipe your son's vomit from the clay bowl. You forgot to rinse it. There wasn't enough water. There never is. You reach for your boots, still damp from the previous day, and your foot slides into the cold, wet leather with a squelch. You wince, but not from pain, from memory. You know how the day will go. It's always the same. You'll eat something thin if there's anything left, oats boiled in water. Again, no salt, no fat, no flavor. Your wife ladles it out without speaking. Her hands are red and cracked. She has a burned scar on her forearm from the hearth. She hasn't smiled in months. Your children sit in silence. They know better than to ask for more. One of them coughs, but not enough to stop eating. That's how you know it's not serious yet. After you eat, you leave the hut. The cold hits you like a punishment. It cuts through your clothes, which are just patched layers of other dead men's tunics, thin and soaked from yesterday's rain. You step into mud. There's always mud. Mud in winter, mud in summer. Mud on your hands, your knees, your feet, your bread. You walk to the field without speaking to anyone. It's not that you're unfriendly, it's that you're tired. Everyone is. You start working, tilling, hauling, pulling with tools older than you are. Wood cracked, rope frayed, your fingers blister, then burst, then callous. You haven't felt your fingertips in 3 years. You work until your vision swims and your knees shake. You stop only to piss behind the hedgerow. You don't drink much, so you don't piss much. The water from the well tastes like metal and rot, but it's all you have. When the sun lowers, you drag your body back home, not because you're finished, but because the light is gone. And without light, you can't see. Without seeing, you can't work, and you don't dare waste a candle. You only have one left. You eat again, the same bowl, the same gruel, the same silence. Then you sit on the floor, not because you want to rest, but because your body won't let you stand anymore. You scratch at your arms. You try not to notice the shaking in your wife's hands. You lie down in the same wet straw you woke up on. You don't change clothes. You don't clean your feet. You pull the same scratchy wool rag over your shoulders and feel a rat scurry somewhere nearby. You close your eyes. You don't pray. You don't hope. You just breathe, shallow, slow, and wait for the next day to do it again. That's not a dramatization. That's not medieval cosplay. That's not a scene from a movie with actors in makeup and a script waiting for rescue. That's what it meant to be alive in the Dark Ages, and you wouldn't survive a week. You've just lived one day in that world, in the hut, in the cold, in the hunger, and maybe you're asking, why was it like that? Why was life so hard, so brutal, so empty? The answer isn't simple, but it starts with a fall, the fall of an empire so massive, so sprawling, that when it crumbled, it took centuries for the dust to settle. The Roman Empire didn't just govern land, it held language together, trade, roads, law, and books. When it fell in the West, around the 5th century, it didn't leave a vacuum. It left chaos, cities emptied, libraries were looted. Stone buildings collapsed into their own foundations, and no one came to rebuild them, because no one knew how anymore. The engineers were gone, the teachers were dead. The knowledge, medicine, science, architecture, law, it didn't disappear overnight. It was just no longer useful in a world where people couldn't read, couldn't write, couldn't afford to care. That's what people mean when they say Dark Ages. It wasn't just dark because it lacked light. It was dark because the lights of progress, of reason, of memory were snuffed out. What replaced them wasn't evil or monstrous, it was silence, isolation, illiteracy. A village might go generations without seeing a map. A man might die without ever hearing his own date of birth. A woman might give birth 5 times and bury 3 children without ever once speaking to someone who could explain why they died. This wasn't a world of swords and knights and dragons. This was a world where most people couldn't count past 20, where belief replaced medicine, where ritual replaced understanding, where fear replaced thought. And this state of unknowing, of stumbling forward in the dark, lasted for centuries. From roughly 500 to 1000 AD, Europe fractured into small kingdoms, into rival warlords, into hunger zones, into silence. There was no central government, no global knowledge, just patches of power and vast oceans of powerlessness. This isn't history written by kings. This is the part of history that kings ignored. The part where the people vanished from record but not from suffering. And the scariest thing about the Dark Ages isn't that they happened, it's that they happened slowly. So slowly that no one living in them ever thought anything was wrong. That life with its hunger and dirt and death was just life, the way things were, the way things had to be, the way they always would be. That's the Dark Ages, not a war, not a plague, not a single event. Just the long, slow forgetting of what it meant to be more than just a body, walking through mud, waiting to die. There was no government, not the way you think of it, no courts you could appeal to, no rights you could name. No guards to protect your family when men came with swords and called themselves your lord. After Rome fell, the idea of law didn't just break, it scattered. Every village was its own island. Every patch of land belonged to someone or to no one until someone stronger claimed it. And once claimed, they owned it all, the dirt, the crops, the rivers, the people. You didn't vote for a leader. You didn't question their power. You called them my lord even if you'd never seen their face, because their power didn't come from ballots, it came from blades. Violence wasn't rare, it was structure, it was how things worked. If a local baron wanted more wheat, he sent men with clubs. If a rival family wanted your land, they didn't sue you, they burned your house and killed your pigs. If you resisted, you were a traitor. If you surrendered, you were a servant. There were no police, no neutral third party. The sword was the law, and the man holding it made the rules. And if you broke them, or if someone said you did, punishment was fast, public, and permanent. You could be tied to a post and whipped until your skin hung in ribbons for stealing bread or failing to pay a tax you didn't know existed. You could be thrown in a pit for speaking against a priest. You could be mutilated for hunting on someone else's land. That land, it used to be the woods your grandfather walked freely. Now it belongs to a man you've never met but whose crest is carved into every tree. And don't expect justice. Don't expect consistency. Lords weren't bound by the same laws as you. In fact, they weren't bound by anything. A good lord might feed your village after a bad harvest. A cruel one might raise taxes during a famine. Either way, you had no say. Your life wasn't yours. Your labor wasn't yours. Your body could be conscripted, your daughter promised, your son taken for war. You couldn't read the laws. And even if you could, they changed depending on who held the sword that season. So people learned not to speak, not to ask, just to work, nod, and hope the attention of power never turned toward them. Because in a world without government, the closest thing to safety is invisibility, and the price of being noticed is almost always blood. Your house wasn't a house, it was a hut. A pile of mud and straw packed around a wooden frame, leaning to one side, always damp, always sinking. There were no bricks, no windows, no floorboards, just dirt, real, cold dirt beneath your feet. In winter it froze. In summer it turned to mud. You didn't clean it. You couldn't. The mud was part of the house. The smell too, smoke, sweat, mold, manure, and boiled roots, that was the air you breathed every hour of your life. The walls were rough, sometimes patched with animal dung to stop the wind. The roof was straw layered thick, tied down with whatever rope or gut you could salvage, but it always leaked. Rain would find its way in drop by drop until you learned which corner of the room never stayed dry, and that's where you slept. Except you didn't really sleep. You collapsed, curled into a ball, not from comfort but from cold. You shared the space with everyone, your wife, your children, maybe your old mother, sometimes even the goat if the weather was bad. One room. No privacy, no door you could lock, no boundary between bodies. You slept on straw, a mat if you were lucky, but it didn't stay fresh for long. After weeks of bodies, rats, fleas, and spilled broth, the straw became its own organism. It scratched, it itched, it stank, it moved. You scratched too, not because it helped, but because it was the only thing you could still control. Every inch of your body carried something. Dirt under the nails, bites behind the knees, cracks between your toes that never healed. There was no furniture, a stool maybe, a wooden chest if you hadn't sold it during last winter's famine, pots, a knife, a blanket full of holes. The fire burned in the center of the room, not in a fireplace, just on bare dirt. The smoke didn't go up, it stayed, it hovered. It soaked into your clothes, your hair, your lungs. Children grew up coughing. Women cooked half blind. You wiped your eyes with the back of your hand and kept stirring. The smoke was life. Without it, there was no warmth. Without warmth, there was no survival. So you breathed it in and you lived with the pain. There was no toilet, not inside. Not nearby, you walked out to the edge of the yard, or didn't. Some nights were too cold, too wet, too dangerous. So you squatted in a corner behind the door where the dog wouldn't go. You wiped with straw. You covered it with ash. You didn't talk about it, no one did. The smell was part of the house. like the mold on the walls, like the rot in the corner where the grain sack used to be, like the death of the child you buried last spring who used to sleep by the door. This was home not just for one family, not just for one winter, but for most people for centuries. This was the best most of them ever had, and when people say the past was simpler, what they really mean is that they've never had to sleep in straw soaked with someone else's blood. You wake up before the sun because no one cares if you're tired. The rooster doesn't ask how you slept. The land doesn't wait. The work begins when the light barely returns, and it doesn't stop until your hands are shaking and your knees give out. You step outside into the same cold, the same wet ground, the same gray sky that has watched you since childhood. You take your tool, dull, worn, wooden, and you walk to the field that doesn't belong to you. It never did, it never will. The land belongs to the Lord, always has. You were born into that contract without paper, without consent. Your body is the only thing you bring into this arrangement, and it is the only thing you'll give until it breaks. You plow with oxen if you're lucky, with your own shoulders if you're not. You sow seeds you were taxed to buy, in soil that was taxed to use, to grow food that will be taxed again when harvested. You owe grain to the church, labor to the manor, and whatever's left you divide among mouths that have already learned not to ask for seconds. You don't work for yourself, you work to stay out of trouble. Because if you miss a day, or plant late, or yield less than expected, you don't get help. You get fined, or beaten, or replaced. You pay rent not in coins, you have no coins, but in time, sweat, and silence. You repair fences that aren't yours, herd animals that aren't yours, harvest crops you don't get to eat. And still, you thank the system that lets you live. Because if the Lord removes your right to that land, you're not just homeless. You're outlawed, you don't exist, you can't farm, you can't trade, you can't even marry. You become a shadow wandering the woods, begging for moldy crusts until someone kills you for trespassing. There's no ladder, no promotion. No land passed down, you inherit nothing but back pain and bone rot. Your father worked this same patch of dirt, he died here, you will too. You know the exact shape of the stone that cracked your plow. You've stepped over it for 12 harvests. It has outlived every pair of shoes you've ever owned. No one thanks you, no one sees you. The noble feasts on your labor and forgets your name before you're out of sight. You break your back for wheat you'll never taste, for boundaries you'll never cross, for a future that doesn't include you. You don't dream, dreaming gets in the way of planting. You don't rest, resting gets in the way of owing. You don't own the land owns you. You can't read, you never could. No one in your family ever did. There was never a school. Never a book, never a reason. Letters aren't for people like you. They're for priests, lords, scribes, men who sit inside stone walls and decide things you'll never hear about. You've seen writing before, carved above a church door, scratched onto parchment nailed to the manor gate, but it may as well be a language from another planet. To you, it's shapes, marks, threats in disguise. When a letter arrives, it's read aloud by someone else, someone who has power, someone who uses words like weapons. You listen, but you don't trust, because how can you argue with a command you can't even pronounce? The Bible is a book you've heard of but never touched. You wouldn't be allowed to, even if you could. The priest tells you what's inside, filtered, translated, edited. You kneel and accept it, not because you believe, but because what choice do you have? The Word of God is law, but you can't check the source. You're expected to obey rules you don't understand, to confess sins you don't remember committing, to fear punishments that haven't been explained. If you ask questions, you're suspicious. If you stay silent, you're obedient. The line between salvation and damnation is written in ink you'll never see. Everything is spoken to you, never with you. You are told what the calendar says, what the seasons demand, when to pay, what to give. What not to say. The law is passed down from mouth to mouth, and by the time it reaches you, it has changed 10 times. But you still must follow it or be punished by it. If you break a rule you didn't know existed, they won't explain. They'll just tie your hands, the village will watch, the lash will fall, and you will learn not through words but through blood. Even your prayers are scripted. You don't know what the Latin means, but you recite it anyway. You bow, you cross yourself. You whisper the words like spells, hoping they work, afraid they won't. Religion isn't comfort, it's code. A set of instructions passed down by men who remind you constantly, you are not worthy, you are fallen, you are filthy. But if you obey, if you kneel hard enough, suffer long enough, pay often enough, maybe someone in heaven will remember you. Maybe, but you don't ask to be remembered. You just try not to be noticed, because questions are dangerous, doubt is deadly. And in a world where you can't read the law, the Bible, the taxes, the signs, obedience becomes the only language you speak. You don't eat to enjoy, you eat to not die. And even then, the difference between surviving and starving is sometimes only a handful of wet oats. You wake up hungry, you go to sleep hungry. Hunger becomes a constant pressure, not sharp, not loud, just always there, like a stone sitting in your gut, pressing, waiting. Breakfast is gruel, always gruel. Crushed grain boiled in water, sometimes with a pinch of salt if you were lucky last season. Most of the time it's flavorless, gray and thin, barely enough to warm your throat. Sometimes it tastes sour. That's not on purpose. The grain has been sitting too long, but you eat it anyway because it's food, because it might be the only thing all day. Bread is the only solid thing you see, not soft bread, not warm, not crusty. Your bread is dark, heavy, and full of bits of husk, of grit, sometimes even stones if the mill was careless. You chew carefully. Everyone knows someone who cracked a tooth on bread, and if a tooth breaks, you pull it out yourself. Or let it rot in your mouth until your cheek swells and your breath smells like a corpse. But the bread, you still eat it, because bread is survival. Meat is a myth. You don't own livestock. If you do, it's not for eating. It's for labor or eggs or milk if they produce. If an animal dies and it's not sick, maybe you'll butcher it. But even then, most of the meat goes to the Lord. You get scraps, the bone, the fat. You boil what's left into broth. You drink it slowly like medicine. You teach your children to sip, not slurp, because there won't be more tomorrow. Vegetables grow in your garden if the weather agrees. Onions, leeks, cabbage if you're lucky. Potatoes haven't even arrived in Europe yet. You eat what's local, what's seasonal, what hasn't rotted. But even when you have enough to eat, it isn't enough to nourish. Your body is always tired, always dry. Your nails split. Your skin cracks, your gums bleed. You've never heard the word vitamin. You've just lived without them your whole life. Water isn't clean. You drink from the same stream the animals shit in, from the same bucket used to rinse the bloody rags. If someone gets sick, the water is the first thing everyone blames and the last thing anyone stops using. You try to boil it when you can afford the fuel. Most of the time you don't, you just pray the fever doesn't come. And when the fever does come, and it always does eventually, you stop eating. You lie in bed and sweat into the straw. The same straw where you ate, the same straw where your child was born, the same straw where someone else died last winter. And when you die, they'll wrap you in the cloth used to strain yesterday's broth. Because cloth, like food, is too valuable to waste. You are what you eat. And what you eat is mold, rot, ash, and hope that somehow doesn't kill you first. When you get sick, there's no medicine, there's no doctor, no diagnosis, no second opinion, there's only guessing, there's only waiting. Maybe it starts with a cough, dry, quiet, harmless. You ignore it. Everyone coughs. There's smoke in the hut. There's dust in the straw. Your lungs have been irritated since you were 5. But then the cough doesn't go away. Then it gets wetter. You start coughing blood. You taste metal in your throat. You wake up in the night gasping for air, your chest tight, your skin cold and sweaty. That's when people stop coming close. That's when your wife starts setting your bowl a little farther from the others. No one says it, but everyone knows. You might be dying, and what can they do? There's no doctor in the village. The nearest one lives in the city, 2 days away, and he wouldn't come even if you begged, even if you could pay, which you can't. He doesn't treat people like you. He treats the wealthy, the clergy, the important, not the nameless, not the muddy, not the ones who smell like fire and pig shit. So instead, they call for the old woman, the healer. She knows herbs, she knows which leaves to boil. She comes with a pouch of dried plants and a bowl of hot water. She mashes roots, she prays, she tells you to rest, and you try, you really do. But your body is burning and shaking and dripping sweat into your own bedding. You can't eat. You vomit anything that touches your tongue. You can't hold down water. You close your eyes and everything spins. You forget the day, then the month, then names. You forget your own son's face, and there are worse sicknesses than yours. The kind that blister the skin, swell the lymph nodes, blacken the fingers. The kind that make mothers throw up blood and babies go cold overnight. Sometimes the illness comes from the water, sometimes from a rat bite, sometimes from nothing at all. There's no explanation, no science, just fear. So when someone starts showing symptoms, the village pulls away, not out of cruelty. Out of terror, you become a threat, a cursed body, a walking warning. People stop visiting, stop talking. They hang charms over their doorways, they whisper, they blame sin. You're left alone to sweat, to rot, to pray. Prayer is the only thing you have, but even that feels pointless. You kneel and beg and repeat the words you were told to say, Latin syllables you don't understand, thrown into the dark like coins into a well. There's no response, no warmth, no dream of angels, just the same ceiling. The same wheezing breath, the same filth under your fingernails as your body empties itself into the straw. And if you die, which eventually you do, your wife wraps you in a blanket already patched from 3 other deaths. She waits until morning, then she calls for 2 men to carry you. You are lowered into a hole behind the hut. No stone, no coffin, just dirt and maybe a cross made from sticks. No one cries out loud, no one screams. They're too tired, too used to it. They still have to cook, still have to work, still have to survive. They eat dinner the same night. And if you live, if by some miracle you survive, you don't come back whole. You're weaker, thinner, slower, less. Your joints ache, your hands tremble, your mind drifts. You can't remember the name of the herb the healer used. You can't remember how long you were sick, but you remember how alone you were. and you know deep down it will happen again. To someone else or to you, because in this world sickness doesn't ask permission, and healing is not promised. There is no doctor, no cure, only prayer and death. This was hell, and no one called it that because no one knew any different. The people who lived through it didn't scream in horror every morning. They didn't claw at the sky and beg for escape. They just lived. They woke up in the cold. They walked through mud. They worked until their backs cracked. They ate mold and grain in silence. They lost children and buried them in the same field where they'd harvest turnips 2 days later, and they did it again, and again, and again, for years, for lifetimes, for generations. No one asked if life could be better, because no one told them it ever was. History forgot them before they died. No records, no gravestones, just names passed down in whispers, if at all. You can walk over their bones now and not even know it. Under fields, under villages, under stones so weathered the carving vanished centuries ago. They weren't kings, they weren't saints, they weren't remembered, but they were real. And what they endured, the hunger, the filth, the fear, the emptiness, wasn't punishment. It wasn't some biblical lesson. It was normal. This was the world as it was, not a fairy tale, not a fantasy. Not a Renaissance painting with smiling peasants and golden light, just survival and the slow erosion of hope. There was no glory, no adventure, no honor, just cold, just work, just dirt and death, and the worst part. They didn't even know they were living in hell, because for them, hell wasn't somewhere you went. It was where you were born and where you stayed until the ground swallowed you.